My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Today we're talking to Paul Sage of Ruckus Games, which was founded in 2021. Paul's career has spanned 25 years across a bunch of very notable companies, including Origin Systems, EA, NCSoft, ZeniMax, and Gearbox. We talked about how he shifted from that big company mentality to wanting to go smaller, and how he and his co-founders approached that. This is a journey I think a lot of folks at big companies think about, and how they would go from the sort of big AAA development into something much smaller, and what that transition would be like. And many who do jump often find it's filled with a lot of pitfalls in how you think about things differently, how you approach things differently. I hope that hearing how Paul navigated them is really interesting and fascinating for all of y'all. And I know I really enjoyed it. So let's jump in. So, welcome to the podcast. I wanted to get started with the first question, which is, when you went on this journey, what made you decide to start and found a company? Like, what was that moment? Like, not just like the macro, like, okay, what was the big idea, but like, okay, you're coming off of your last project, you're coming off of your last opportunity, and you're like, nope, now's the time to go insane and start a company. What was that moment?
Yeah, and it's funny because we talk about it being a moment, and it's I think it was more of a slow burn for me and kind of the founding group, and really it came down to and I don't want to get into past companies too much, other than to say that I'd been in AAA development pretty much my entire career, and one of the things that starts to get to you is you start to notice some things like AAA development is really expensive, and there's a lot of waste in it, and that waste starts to wear on you over time. Like, you're throwing away designs that may have been good designs, or there's problems with people communicating together, or you're using technology that's really not getting you anything much more than if you hadn't used that technology. So you're wasting a lot of this time. And eventually what happens is it just becomes a confluence of things, where you've seen this waste, and you also see something else that happens in AAA development, which is what I'll call, like, the franchise. Like, the franchise wins all the decisions, right? We're afraid to hurt our core player base working with this franchise, so we don't take the risks. And if you don't take this risk, you still are actually risking alienating those people, because is the sequel going to be too similar to the last game, or are you making the right improvements? All of those things are still risks, and yet the risk aversion always happens when some person just doesn't like that particular risk. Like, oh no, this will alienate our core player base, right? And so you get into that trap, and you understand from a business perspective, especially now, being a founder, like, why you are so risk adverse in certain cases. But it's not going to make a great game. You're not going to make that hit. You're not going to repeat that energy. And so I think all of those were like this really strong confluence of, like, it's just time. And there was one more thing, and again, I love working at Gearbox, but with the Embracer thing, it felt like a time for kind of a clean break for us, of saying, like, hey, I think this is the catalyst, more or less. And there was nothing there. It's not like we had some beautiful premonition like that Embracer was going to be trouble or something like that. That's not it at all.
Yeah.
It was literally just, this is a time when there is a transition happening, where I think we can go do something that we think is going to be super fun for players, and really is the moment. And so we kind of walked into it like that, and you can start already seeing some naivete in there of like, okay, well, yeah, you definitely want to change the practices of AAA and all these other things, but that's naive. Like if you're talking about starting a business, it's a large undertaking, right? And so I think there was definitely some naivete in there as well, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think every founder, especially first time founders, a huge part of it is what you don't know doesn't stop you, is as much as what you do know enabling the process.
Yeah.
Um, Out of curiosity, like, had you thought about, has founding a studio been something in the back of your head for a while, or was it just a like you got to this point, you felt like this very natural transition energy, and you and your co-founders were like, yeah, let's do it. Like now's the time.
Uh, what's funny is I was actually on the opposite end of that for a long time. Of there would be people who would often talk about founding studios, and it's hard. Like even if you have the naivete, it's hard. And so I'm kind of on the other side of that. Like I love making games. That's what I signed up to do. So why would I go add more difficulty to something that's already difficult? And so no, it actually wasn't that. But I think over time it just became one of those things where we started to say, and not talking about my age too much, but I've been in the industry for getting close to, you know, 25 years, maybe over that even. And So once you start saying that, you're like, well, what am I doing in the industry if I'm not actually doing something positive to change the industry, right? You start having those thoughts, and I think that's what kind of drives that as much as anything else with the founders is what can we do to make this industry a little better. Um, and I think actually lowering the cost of development, as mundane as that sounds, is one of those things that I think helps a lot. And you'll hear me probably talk too much about this, but being developer centric and really concentrating on the people I work with day after day and taking care of them
Yeah,
is been a big thing.
yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so you sort of feel like the transition moment is happening with Gearbox. You're like, hey, maybe now's the time. You have this idea of wanting to focus on reducing the cost of development, focusing on a development centric thing. Maybe you have a game idea that's been percolating or not, um, and you're like, okay, we're gonna do this thing. We don't even know what this thing is, but we're gonna do this thing.
Yeah.
What what was the biggest things that you're like, okay, now I have to go and figure out X, Y, and Z before we really commit to this?
So, and this is now we're getting into inside baseball, but we had a joke amongst the founders and myself, which is our motto was "We am dumb," and that really was a joke of just saying there's just a ton of stuff we don't know. I immediately went into research everything mode. So I had audio books about starting companies, about raising capital, all of those things, and I immediately went into that mode. I can't stress enough that you absolutely must like research all of the legal things you can research. You need to understand venture capital. I read this book. I probably had like 3 books about how to raise venture capital, how to do that. And one of our earliest discussions was honestly about, do we want to go for a publishing deal or do we want to try to raise venture capital? And as you know, that's a tricky discussion to have, because who you're appealing to is very different. But the reason we went with venture capital was that we felt we wanted to have a publisher down the line, but we wanted to have a game where we could actually have a good discussion with the publisher down the line. And so that's one of those things that we had to like really discuss as a founding group and know. So I think that learning of what is venture capital, how we're going to fund the studio, like is this decision point, and once you've decided that, you've got to learn everything you can about that. So we had to learn things like, what is a seed, what is a series A round, like even the simplest things now that I don't even think of, we had to learn all that for the first time. And then we started to having to put together models. And honestly, the math and putting together the models is the easy part for us, right? That's what we do all the time. And the more difficult thing is, okay, what's driving them, like what's driving this particular investor, what is the thing we want, how much research can we do on this investor, how much do we know about them. And I think that anybody who's starting it, if you're not researching your investors, you're making a mistake. You really need to know who they are, what they like, before you actually get into talks with them. And I think we hit a couple of times where we actually didn't do that, and I think it came back to bite us.
When you talk about, you mentioned reading books and podcasts and all this kind of stuff to sort of learn even just the basics of what is startup and how do fundraise. Is there any particular one that you would like shout out as like, hey, this was a really influential one, or like I really got a lot out of this?
Oh, I wish I could remember it, but I know it had venture capital in the title, and it was something like how to like beat the lawyers and people in venture capital. And I'll have to get back to you on it. I don't remember the name of the book, but it was fantastic. Like it was the one who said, go in, make sure you research, make sure you know the people and the investors. It's probably one of the best books I can think of. So if I can give you a link to it later, I will, and you can share that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put it
Yeah,
at the in the show notes or whatever I end up creating for this.
yeah.
From it sounds like we sort of already talked about it, and a lot of what you've mentioned is learning. I call it applying my product skills to fundraising, which is like know your customer, know what they want, know that kind of stuff. And it sounds like that's a really big learning you sort of walked away from the start of your founding journey of like, hey, I went and learned a bunch about startups, and this seems like the most important thing that I want to make sure that if someone asks you what should I think about when starting a startup, that's a big piece of advice. But just check in, like, is that the biggest learning that you would pass on to someone who is right at that very beginning point of like, should I found a company or not, or is there another learning for that person you would share?
Yeah, I honestly think that if you don't do that research, you're sunk. Quite honestly, and I actually mean like the research of the basics of the business and things like that. I could tell you one of the second things is getting a good attorney, that you can talk to. And when I say getting a good attorney, we had somebody that we talked to. Obviously, you don't spend a lot of time in this industry without developing relationships and things like that. Uh, but I would say that get an attorney that has done series or seed, series A, and series B if you can, and has worked on these game deals. And so that'll help as well. But honestly, I wouldn't have traded the reading for anything, and you have to be tenacious about it, because there were times where people just use lingo, and if you don't understand what they're talking about when you're talking to them, if you don't understand how to put together that presentation, then I think you're sunk right out of the gate. So you really have to know how to present and what to present. Um, so again, yes, biggest thing is do the research, read those books. Second is probably get a good attorney, and the third thing I would say, if we're going in the Nintendo rule of threes, is absolutely vet your presentation down to the core elements. And again, know your audience, as far as what they're looking for, right? If you're going with a publisher, game, 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 game. If you're going with VC, team, 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 right? Like there's a very different thing there, where you have to understand who I'm presenting to and what they want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dial into some elements of your founding journey. And I wanted to start by talking about co-founders a bit. So, what is your sort of co-founder makeup? Like, how many co-founders? What are the general like skills and presences? And what role do you specifically play in that mix?
Yeah, that's really interesting for us because we've raised many eyebrows. There's seven of us, of co-founders, and we did it because we think like developers, and so we had a concept lead, an art director, a lead artist. We had a 3D modeler. Uh, we had a world director, a UI UX director, right? Early on we had a producer, we lost that producer, so that's another thing we could talk about is losing one of your founders. We also had a CTO, engineer, and then myself as a game director. So we kind of had a lot of the core elements of making a dev team. We walked into this, and to this day, I still think this is really important. Um, is having the ability to make something right away, and having the ability to put a prototype together so people can understand that. So that was our co-founder makeup. It was pretty large, but it was having a team that could actually develop a prototype.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and was that the sort of guiding force of deciding what that founding group was? Is like, hey, it really being like, what is that core game development team that can carry whatever we need to build on its shoulders?
Yeah, that was a very big guiding principle for us. Now, yeah, a lot of us left Gearbox, but I think getting a group who could develop a game was the most important thing to us. Now, we could have said that not all of us were equal, but that wouldn't have felt genuine to what we were really trying to do. And so we maintain a very equal status as co-founders.
Awesome. And you just sort of mentioned that a lot of the co-founder group had come out of Gearbox, but that
Mhm.
sounds like not all of you. So like, how did you sort of find the coworkers? Was it all a team that you had worked with together, or how did that come together?
Yeah, so a lot of us, as I said, uh, when we were at Gearbox, I think we all knew that we were going to do different things. Like, not that we'd given notice or anything like that, but we knew the people who were leaving after a certain amount of time, and then I think once you know that people are leaving, you understand. Hey, this is a certain time when we could all get together and talk, and so yeah, I think that was just that was a catalyst of also is knowing that group. But we all worked together. We all really got along pretty well. And I would say one of the things that I didn't mention in the mix, I'm kind of mentioning like, okay, here's all the jobs that we do, which isn't quite as interesting as having people that you can talk to who will ask you hard questions and aren't afraid to ask you hard questions, right? We'd all worked together for a long time, honestly. And some of us have actually worked together for over 15 years. Um, and you need that in the mix of people who aren't afraid to call you when you're, you know, messing up, or compliment you when you're doing well. And so you've got to have that in the mix. And if you don't have that honesty, I often find, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I'm saying that we do better when we're very open and honest with each other than we do when we're like, oh, I'm just going to let that slide, or oh, that's that'll work itself out. It never does, and you got to hit those things head on, and that's why I trust this group so much, is that we're able to talk to each other pretty openly.
Yeah, no, I think that trust between co-founders to have those difficult conversations and resolve disagreements and stuff is so critical to um, really coming together as a good co-founding group and being solid. Uh, when you guys were talking about it, and especially with a larger founding group, right? I'm curious, what were the most important conversations for y'all to have as you were coming together as a founding group? So, sort of after you've made the decision, and more as you're like, what is? Are we the right team for each other? Is this the right journey that we all want to go in together? How will we operate on this journey together? What were the most important conversations for that group to have, and tell us a little bit about how they went.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question of, what, because you remember like a lot of these different conversations, but one that certainly sticks out to me was us giving ourselves a deadline for when we were able to actually fund the company. And so that first year, we said we'll give ourselves a year from now. And if we aren't funded, or we're not on the path to funding, then this didn't work, right? That's a really hard conversation to have, because there's a number of things about that conversation when you think about it. None of us were rich. We don't live in mansions. We weren't the people that hit it big, at companies. And it's actually one of the reasons that we founded a company was developers aren't as well taken care of as I think they should be for what they do. And so, none of us are rich, and all of us are saying we're about to give up a year of income, and that's a full year of income in your life to devote to trying to start a company, and that's a really hard conversation to have, right? And saying I'm committed to this, right? And then are the people actually committed to this? Like, I can't take this step unless you say you're committed to this year. Because if you're not committed to this year, then there's no sense in me even going 3 months without income because, we're all in this together or we can't make this work, right? That is as scary as I think it gets when you really break it down of like what do people do for insurance, when they don't have it. We have founders that have large families, right? That took this risk. And the thing I will say coming on the other side of that is that it also bonds you to those people of like if somebody says, hey, one of your founders, isn't doing something I need them to do, you become very defensive for that founder because you're like, hey, by the way, they took a whole year out of their life with no income to do this, right? Like, they're pretty committed, like maybe they made a mistake, and so I think that really binds you. But that conversation really sticks out of my mind, honestly, because we did have one person drop. Even after they committed to that, I understood why. There were, it was a super stressful time. Honestly, one of the things I would say that to anybody who's thinking about starting is how well do you handle stress, like, and you need to have a really good conversation with yourself about it. But we also brought in two people. We brought in one person who was on the founding journey, and they were kind of like the cheerleader for like, this is great, you get to, you're your own boss, you get to make these decisions, yada yada. And we both know that the you're your own boss is not true at all. But it's a nice illusion to have, right? But at the next point, I brought in somebody who I knew very well was going to be the don't even do this, but you're not going to listen to me because you're dumb and you're going to do it anyway. So we also had the naysayer we brought in, right? And that was really great to get both those perspectives. Um, but I think what we did that really early to kind of test our own resolve. So having somebody who was able to do that was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. One thing I often uh, have had conversations with prospective founders, um, and I have seen other teams struggle with when they have larger founding groups, is really being able to make that distinction between a founder mindset versus a first employee mindset. And some folks who want to be part of founding teams often want to be like they want to be the game director as the first employee on a fresh team, but don't want to share the burden of the founders of the company, right? Was that a conversation of sort of that delineation between the whole group of like, hey, we're not employees anymore. We are carrying this company on our shoulders, and how did some of the folk like I imagine a 3D modeler, even a very senior principal one, that's a very different mind shift, and I'm curious how the group sort of dealt with that.
Yeah, I would say that's always one of the hardest things, right? Is how much does that happen? Um, but it kind of works itself out eventually, to some extent. And what I mean by that is, imagine that we just talk about like when we incorporated, we had to elect officers, right? And some of the people, like I thought, oh, okay, there'll be people who want to be officers, um, and this may be contentious, but no, it wasn't. And in fact, I wish it were more contentious at some level because there are some people who are like, no, no, you're fine. You go ahead and do that, right? And so I think that you almost get a natural thing there of the people who kind of want to be the quieter founder, and who don't want to be so active in that, and they want to have a voice when certain decisions are made, but they also want to be able to trust that the people who become officers are the people who are carrying the company. And quite honestly, when we were starting out, that might have been a frustration of mine, but as it's grown, I've just kind of understood that everybody brings something to the table, right? And as long as you can get an understanding of that and understanding what they bring to the table, then you say like, okay, I may have to sacrifice something I like doing to do this other thing, but that's okay, right? And as an example, like CEO takes a lot of my time away from things I love doing, like on design or whatnot. Um, but that's okay. That was what I opted for. And eventually, will that have rewards? That's not why I'm doing this, right? I'm doing this because I want this company to be rewarding for all the people who work at it. So
Yep, for sure. So let's dive into a topic that you and I have actually talked a lot about separately as we've been going on our journeys, which is fundraising.
yeah.
Every founder's favorite topic. What's the biggest difference between how you thought you would fundraise, right? So like you sort of told the story is that you did all this research, you did all these books, you're like, publisher versus VC, it'll go like this is how we need to do it. What's the biggest difference between how you thought things would go with fundraising and what actually happened?
Yeah. So I told you that we had a year that we had set aside. And when we first started, we had people, even though we had said we know this is going to be hard, I don't think any one of us understood what that meant as far as this was going to be hard. Um, and there's nothing like whipping you back to your high school self of asking, people to go to the dance with you and being rejected 450 times, you know, uh, quite like fundraising can be. So it was shocking, right? And I think when we started out, it wasn't that we thought we would get fundraising, but we had all of these people say, your group is awesome. You guys, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And that's because we are coming right on the tail end. And unfortunately, we were on the tail end of when all of these people, were throwing money in and doing all these things with VC. And one of the biggest surprises was the number of people who just didn't really care about what we were doing, like, which was really weird to us. And we as developers were like, hey, we have this game idea and we think blah blah blah, and we went to publishers. Certainly the publishers cared about it, but we went to VC were like, let's talk about your team and let's talk about what your goals are and let's talk about those things. And that was really interesting to get your head around. They want to know, can you develop the business? They want to know, can you make this work? And then Carl, just I'll be blunt. The number of horrible suggestions that happened to us along the way. Um, you know, uh, NFTs were like the big thing when we were
Yep.
coming in, and they're like, "Oh, you should absolutely be doing this. Like, why isn't that part of your pitch? At least get it in there in some capacity. At least mention Web3. At least do all the." And we're like, we don't know anything about that. We're literally game developers. That's not, And they're like, well, this is what's going to do it. And now it's AI. Um, and you hear those things, but they're boondoggles, right? And when you get right down to it and you look at the successes that come out of our industry, it's always a good game. It always starts with a good game, right? And so that journey for fundraising of having to learn how to say NFTs aren't for us in a really like good way that doesn't put people off who are convinced that that's the future. When you have to learn how to be very politic in what you say, um, and so we didn't expect any of that. That was shocking to us, the amount of that, and I think it comes from a lot of VCs that were technology VCs that were trying to get into gaming that don't yet understand the gaming space as well as they probably should. So it sounds arrogant. I don't mean it to be, but it's the truth.
No, absolutely. And I think hindsight it has the clearest view, right? And we see now in 2024 when folks were coming in 2020 and 2021, and even a little bit in 2022, right? It brought a lot of new investors into the game space, but new investors often have to get up to speed with the industry that they're stepping into. Not everyone did to the degree that we we who have been in this industry forever might have liked, and that has all sorts of different repercussions. And some people win out of that, some people lose out of that.
Yeah.
But if you're comfortable sharing, could you tell us a bit about how you're actually funded?
Yeah. I'm very comfortable, but because I I always tell people, as difficult as the journey was, we somehow keep winding up with people I would call Cinderella investors. Like they're the best at what they do. And so, I can mention. Hopefully, I can mention names here.
Yeah, of
You know,
course.
uh, I think Transcend has been remarkable with this. They really do understand games. Bitcraft, right up there. They're very heavy into like understanding games and letting us, they're great for promoting us as well, which is something that even we didn't do well early on. So they've been great and have helped us. And then we'll get into this. You're getting a preview, but we got a Series A, and that Series A was led by Crafton. Again, how can you ask for better than getting somebody like Crafton as part of that. And then we had another company. Um, uh, they're known for Art Nights, if you pay attention to that, but it's Hypergriff. And again, they know a lot about China. They know a lot about games development in the East, and so again, that's you can't get much better than not only having like not a ton of investors, but having like a core group of investors that are really knowledgeable about gaming. And it was just a really good match across the board for us. So it sounds like I'm giving you the founder spiel, but I'm really not. I'm kind of saying like, for those people who don't know, this is a really good group of investors and strategics that I don't think we could have asked for better, to be honest with you.
Yep. Yeah, like I've heard nothing but good things about all of those groups, and I think for those listening, like I think I would reinforce that there, when you find the right investor who lines up and really understands what you get, it can be transformative. And I think there are absolutely, top tier investors that are sort of generically true in the industry, but there's also the top tier for you and your studio, right? And your game and your product and business, right? And so I've heard nothing but good things about Transcend from many people, but I'm sure that for some group of companies, Transcend is even a 10 times multiplier of influence there.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Especially for like, I mean, I can't tell you how many presentations we went back and forth with them on, and as developers, we tend to want to let our games speak for us. Certainly, that's the way I've always been encouraged to even talk to the press. It's like it's not about bragging. Um, but when you get into presentations where you're presenting what you're doing to potential investors, you have to put a little bit of that showmanship and that bragging into it, and really hype yourself up, right? Because they want to know who they're investing in is awesome. But that's so counterintuitive to where we've been before, right? And people are like, well, what is the numbers of game sales you've had, or what number can you attach to the sales you've had, as far as money, and if you've probably never thought about it before, right? But some of the games that I've worked on, if I were in Hollywood, and had returned some of the things that the games I've worked on have returned, like you'd be a really well-known director, but in games, that's just not the way it works. So it's a very interesting cycle of like, oh, we have to learn to hype ourselves and hype the founders in the studio more than that. And I would say, if you don't have investors that are helping you in that way, like to learn how to do those things, then uh, that could be harmful. But I'm super fortunate that we had such great investors there.
So just to quickly boil it up, it sounds like you had a entirely VC led and participated seed, followed by a strategic led and VC participated Series A.
Yes, absolutely. Um, and we did that honestly, and we haven't even talked about this, and I guess I should because we said, hey, what also surprised you? The absolute crushing part of the interest rates rising for how investors will invest and how the money dried up over that time, right? We got um, into the Series A raise at that point when really the money had just completely started drying up, and you've seen those charts where the investments have gone down. Um, but we knew that strategics were, they have cash that they need to invest, right? That is part of what they're doing, and so that was the best way to get to the VCs is to have a strategic say, we believe in them, and then the VCs can come in. And so that was something that internally we talked about. That luckily our founding group was smart enough to say like, hey, this is what we think will happen. Um, and sure enough, that was the strategy we took.
Awesome. Um, so I want to focus a little bit on you, very specifically you,
Okay, yeah.
Paul. What are your primary support structures for yourself as a
Uh, Primary support structures. All honesty, my wife and my family is a big one. I am fortunate in that we're remote. I work from home. I do get to see my wife. I do get to talk to her about these things. There's an outlet there. Um, that's one of the big things for me as a support structure. I'm pretty blunt, so I also the other founders. Um, you know, I definitely have had my moments where, I do remember a time last December where I'm kind of like, man, this is getting pretty rough, and talked to some of my founders, and it's funny, uh, the roles had been reversed, right? Normally, I'm the one who's like, hey, let's be even and calm through this, and definitely having like one of the founders say like, hey, it's all okay. Everything's all right now. We're all good. Because I think the reason it was important to have one of the other founders say that was because I knew we'd all been feeling the same things. Um, and when you have somebody else say, I'm not worried, you don't have to keep reassuring me, that's good, right? Because there's that pressure where you're like, am I the pillar here? And then having somebody else say, nope, I'm right there. I'm also the pillar. We've got this, dude. And it's like, all right, great, thank you. And you need that moment. So that's been really important of having that. And then the other thing is getting my butt up out of my chair, and going to the gym, going for walks, whatever it might be. Um, you know, that's always been a really important thing, but definitely, there's only so many 10-hour, 15-hour days that you can spend before you really need to get up and do something else. So yeah,
Yep, sure. Literally touching grass.
absolutely.
Um, what's the biggest gap where you feel like you wish you had more support? Like a place where you're like, maybe you have something, but you're like, I could really use more.
I think we're hiring into that now. But I would say on the day to day, there's a lot of little things that we end up doing. There's a 30-minute meeting here, a 20-minute meeting here, right? That after a while, and this has been true at almost any job I've had, but you look back and you said, did I do anything today? Like, what did I do today? You were mentioning like, hey, do all the founders take on that stuff, right? And so it's the things like, hey, I've got to communicate with the investors, or I've got to put together this report, or I've got to go talk to the bank, or I've got and eventually, um, if you're doing so many of those things, you need to put that out. And so that's one of the things. It tends to be, can I get the little things out of the way, uh, from that, and look, we were talking about, and if you don't mind me going off on a bit of a tangent here,
Go ahead.
um, some of the frustrations with investors. So one of the things I will say that struck us by surprise, and this does relate to like the frustration of the sheer amount of I guess we call it like user data, data collection, early data collection about your game. And so one of the things that's absolutely difficult is you understand why they want this early user feedback, why they want this data, and it's because they're nervous and they want reassurance about their own, potential investment or whatever it is. And I'm not talking about our investors currently. I'm talking about potential investors and like, hey, we want to see data, we want to see these things. But again, you heard me say how frustrating it is in that they don't know game development as well as you would hope, right? And this is one of those things where early user testing has never proved anything ever, in my opinion. Um, and if it did, then all of the EA games, all of the Ubisoft games, all of the 2K, like name any publisher, all of their games would be amazing because nobody does early user testing as much as they do. And yet they tend to get games that come out at 70s. You're seeing that right now, right? You're seeing that so often and so repeated in like a lot of the new things. And the reason is because when they're trying to even out those valleys, right? That they don't want that dip in like, oh, this is a bad thing that players don't like. While they're trying to even out those valleys, they're also shrinking those mountains of greatness, right? And they don't think about it. And what they're doing is they're averaging out those things. And that's what early user testing can do. Now, I love late user testing. I think that's critical to a game success. So if anybody says, hey, he's talking about user testing, but when you're looking at how do I explain this to people, this is actually one of my biggest, was one of my biggest stress points. As silly as it is like, how do I get people to understand they need to back off of the creative process and not try to get involved in it with like, these things that will help reassure them that are going to make things worse. Um, and that, Carl, I can tell you has been one of my biggest stress points of like, I understand why they want the data. You can understand it intellectually, but when we talk about that user testing and it coming in, it's like, no, trust your developers, trust that they're going to do something. Late user testing is great. You need to get those DAUs and all of that stuff, totally good. But the early user testing is crap, and you need to quit asking for it. As weird as this is to say, like that's one of my biggest like support things. I wish I had more people that were out there sharing this with investors, and sharing this kind of same point of view of like you're actually hurting the things that you want to go well by trying to get into early. Nobody goes and tells you what colors to paint with when you're creating a painting.
Maybe that sort of idea of having to take on investor education is the thing. But just zooming out over your entire founding journey and sort of like you as a person taking this on, what do you feel like your really biggest struggle personally has been on the founding journey, and how have you been approaching it?
I think if we took how I look at things, sorry, this is a somewhat complex answer. Um, I tend to believe that you should buy the things or do the things or do whatever that makes you happy now, right? Whereas my wife is a very big planner for like, hey, let's like get our retirement fund set up and things like that. I'm like, absolutely, but make sure you're spending fun time now. I think for the last 3 years, make sure you're spending fun time now went away for me. Like no vacations really. Um, Almost everything was around the business. It's very hard to like leave moment to moment. There's not a time where I'm not wondering what's going on. There's not a time where I'm not like thinking about like, okay, how are we going to do this? And so that inability to really set aside some time for myself and just say I'm taking a vacation or I'm doing those things that normal everyday people should be doing all the time, right? And so it's funny because this is kind of an admission, really. That's like one of the first times I've really said it out loud, but it's pretty striking that's it. So I think that's definitely been one of the most difficult things. Was I don't even play games as much as I used to because of how much time I spend with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I definitely struggle with too, of being able to turn off. And like, I think I've taken some time away from the computer, but I don't think I've taken any time away from the work, right? And I think that's something that is definitely a struggle for a lot of founders. Is part of going on this journey to some degree means that you kind of activate that where you can't turn it off, and you have to find ways to go with that for sure. What do you see on the horizon for yourself and the company that you're thinking a lot about?
Ship. uh, the look, I mean, the reason is a very personal reason I'm a developer, and that's that has to do with a game that I played when I was 16 that made me feel like this amazing sense of joy and just wanting to do that, and that's really permeated my entire career. In fact, one of the people we talked to along this way was an angel investor, and he said, "How come you're not jaded yet?" And I was like, wow, that's a horrible thing to ask. you know um but I'm looking forward to Ship's scary. Ship is rough, but even the worst game I worked on had its people who loved it and who love it to this day. And you know we're fortunate in that we do get to see reactions for good or ill sometimes, but we do get to see the reactions, and you do get to see the impact you make, that you bring joy into people's life instead of a lot of the other things that you might bring into people's life, right? Like, we've all said the wrong thing at one time or another. We've all done the wrong thing. But when your career is about bringing joy into people's life, there are worse things by far. Um, and somebody one time said, "Hey, what we're doing isn't, we're not changing people's lives. We're not doing, and because we're not doctors or we're not attorneys." And I think that that perspective isn't one I share. I actually think what we do is really important. Um, and so, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting our game out there and bringing that sense of joy to people. And I certainly hope it's a hit. But more than anything, I really want it to be something that people are like, we haven't seen anything quite like this. This is super fun. This is really unique. Um, but it's familiar. And so, dude, I'm that is literally day to day what keeps me going for the most part, is like, man, I love this. I love watching people have a good time with something we did.
Yep. No, I definitely agree with that. And I vibe very hard with the I'm looking on the horizon to ship. Um, so last question before I do a bunch of co-founder dating questions. Uh, Given the experience thus far, would you found another company? Like assume sometime in the future Ruckus is gone. However, Ruckus is gone, right? No specifics of like whether it was an amazing exit or not a great exit, but like sometime in the future you are faced with this choice again. Do you want to found another company? Do you say
Yeah.
yes?
Yeah, so this question is like asking a married person if they'd get remarried if their spouse died, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, kind of.
yeah, and so the question is would the lightning ever strike again, right? Like, would you have the right founding people with you again along the journey? Um, would you be able to build the team you had along the journey? So it's not a, is there anything so negative that happened to you? Would you not do it again? It's more like, would you get all the positives in line to make you want to do it again? And so I think if those positives came in line, then yeah, absolutely. That's something that I would consider doing again. But it's not about the negatives, man. The negatives are always going to be there. It's always been there in everything I've done. That's the way life tends to be. But the positives are the thing you look for to make you say, would I do it again if the circumstances were right? And yes, of course. I think I would. Right? Absolutely.
Great. So let me ask you a series of questions that I asked every co-founder I've dated for both of the studios that I've started. As honestly as kind of like initial starting round, just like let's do some introspection to just see where we line up. And so the first question is, what is your superpower?
I think my superpower is the ability to put myself in the shoes of just a normal everyday player of games. I tend to like lots of different types of games, but I tend to be the thing like, oh, we're going a little too hardcore. Let's tone it down a little bit here because players might not like this, or no, let's bump this up because this is exciting for players. So I really think that there are people who are better than me at like coding for sure. Like there are people who are better than me at design, just quite frankly. And art, I don't even want to talk about. Um, but that ability to say, I know that players are going to like this thing is really kind of my shining guiding star. And so that's kind of my superpower.
Awesome. Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
Tenacity, stubbornness, a sometimes being even keel, sometimes not, but for the most part, I would say that, and the ability to just learn and tackle new things. So I think those are all strengths. I love the ability to learn something new. And I think it's really important doing what I do to want to do that. But stubborn is definitely high on the mark.
Yeah, I like that you started that answer with two words that mean the same thing, but one is positively associated and one is negatively
Right.
associated.
I did it for a reason, and you're about to ask me the opposite, right?
Yeah, great. What are your big weaknesses?
Yeah, stubbornness. So I say this because I never will forget somebody once said something to me, and it's proven remarkably true, and that is that your biggest strengths are often your biggest weaknesses as well. And it sounds so counterintuitive until you really get to know people and you realize that those things that have made them successful sometimes are also the things that don't. So sometimes, yes, I can be stubborn. Though and also I will say that another weakness I have is when things get very stressful, I become very cold in logic in trying to solve a problem, and I think sometimes that can prevent me from seeing the more emotional side of things. It's not really that I get aggressive or anything of that nature. It's that I get very like, let us solve this. You know, feelings are separate here. Hold on, let me solve. Right. And I think that's something where I wish I could um be a little bit more emotionally kind of sensitive in times that are stressful versus like, hey, let's solve the problem and then let's address, all the things that we're feeling at this point. So yeah.
Awesome. I like that you mentioned that, sort of the quote from someone about your greatest strengths are also your biggest weaknesses. Uh, Part of the reason why these first three questions were the first three questions I talked to folks about in co-founder dating comes from something that a good friend of mine said, which is the strengths and weaknesses of an organization are the strengths and weaknesses of the founders. Um, and so I think you're right in that the strengths and weaknesses are almost always connected. And I'm always looking for the like, okay, cool. How are my strengths and weaknesses, or whoever I found with strengths and weaknesses, going to show up in the organization long term, and how destructive will that be? And ideally, how do you counteract that by being aware of it, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned this, so I'm curious if it's the same answer. But what are your stress reactions?
When when people that I work with are threatened in some way is probably one of the biggest things that puts stress on me. So imagine me thinking about having to shut down a company or somebody saying, hey, I'm questioning this that such and such did, even though you're like, well, wait a minute, I trust them more than I trust you, right? Those things cause me a lot of stress. And so, therefore, my stress reaction tends to be one of let's solve the problem sometimes. And sometimes that's a really great stress reaction, right? And sometimes that's the wrong stress reaction, right? And so, but it is the way I tend to process, which is go into logical, critical thinking mode of how we get through this. Um, sorry, what it will take to get through this versus how we get through this. I should qualify because sometimes the how we get through this is less important than what will it take to get through this.
Yep. Out of curiosity, just as a follow up there, um, does that defensiveness show up in the stress reaction as well, especially when involving team or whatever? Like, do you find that the sort of combination of you know, per, you know, protectiveness slash defensiveness shows up in those sort of stress moments?
Yeah, it really is. It really, I don't think it's defensive as much. Maybe it is. I don't know. It's not on the outside looking. It really is protectiveness in a lot of ways, right? Eh, eh, I do think it shows. I think I wear it on my sleeve. Yeah, I do. Um, because I think one of the things, I remember a discussion I had one time with a guy I really like and trust, but it was on Elder Scrolls Online. Um, and this is germane to how I react to a lot of things. He said something where it's like, well, I think we have to lay a bunch of people off, right? And he said it coldly enough, and I was like, you do understand that these are people who've helped us, all along, and you know, there's no way this should be our first response. Like we should be looking at other things that we can do. Um, and I think that kind of reaction is both good and bad. Like I don't know what it is. Like really, like at some point you do have to make business decisions, but again, I get really, really protective of those people, and so that's the thing. It's like I would rather do almost anything than have to go through that. Um, and that may be, Carl, quite honestly, in the fact that one of the earliest places I worked was EA, and in the late '90s, early 2000s, they were notorious for laying people off uh, yearly. And I went through one day, and I know people who worked there will remember this day, where we had to lay something like 30 people off. Like, and I was responsible for having to talk to some of those people, um, well, a lot of those people, and I meant just 30 people from my department, right? And that was incredibly difficult, and just something you never want to live through again. So that yeah. That, that does inform a lot of like why I think I get so protective.
100%. And finally, last question: what are your upkeep needs?
Yeah, so for me, I very much need to see people play what we've been doing. Um, I think that's one of the biggest upkeep needs I have is I want, like, even if it's the feedback is not positive, I still want people playing what we're doing. And so when we go a long time without having played the game for some reason or something like that, that's when I'm like, oh no, oh no, oh no, like let's get into this. Or, you know, because I want my work, guilty, but I want my work to be enjoyed by people, right? And so, um, I think that's a big deal. And so that's when I kind of need that upkeep of like, hey, let's do a play test, or let's do something else to like really, yes, it's part of evaluating the project, but really there's that part of me, that's like, I hope you're having a good time with this, right? So that's as guilty as it is, that's one of the things that I really need.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for answering all the questions. If folks want to reach out to you or get in touch with you here after the podcast, is there any particular way you'd prefer that inbound communication?
Sure. If anybody's listening in the podcast, I'm pretty open for the most part, though I can be slow to respond at times. But you can go to our website, www.ruckus-games.com. But also, once you know that, then it's not very hard to put psage at ruckus-games.com. And it's a pretty easy way to get a hold of me. And I may be slow, but I do tend to respond.
Awesome. And are there any shout outs or any things that you want to say here at the end of the pod before we leave?
Again, uh, this whole thing was talking about that journey. Um, what I will say is my shout outs go to everybody on my team who's been on this journey with me, and I don't just mean the founding team. I mean all the people we've been able to hire. Great engineers I work with, great business people I work with, art. No, I'm kidding, to my artists and designers. But I mean, look, it's an amazing team. I'm super glad we have them. So, yeah, definitely shout out to Ruckus. You guys are awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Carl. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it. and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano. Music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work for games. He's doing stuff for Jam&T Studios. He's great. He can implement stuff in Unreal 5. If you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounder.org or email me, carl@gamefounder.org. Thanks so much.